So we turn to our third great global persecution, the Mongol Persecution, and we're dating that from about 1295 to 1453. We call it the Mongol Persecution, but as some will know, the Mongols, of course, are not Muslims when they start out. So we're really dating the Mongol Persecution when one of the great Khans in 1295 becomes a Muslim. And then we're running it through to about 1453 when his successors sweep all the way to Constantinople and they sack the city with great violence. And indeed, violence is the key tactic in this period. Mongols are violent anyway, but when they turn to Islam, this violence gets expressed against the Christians of Asia. What we're really talking about is that in the 14th century, we see genocide practiced against Asian Christianity. And Christianity will not become predominantly a non-Western religion until as late as the 1980s or 1990s, 500 years. That's how permanent a mark this persecution leaves on the history of the church. At the beginning, the Mongols swept all before them. They were brilliant military fighters. They could travel great distances. A warrior would have 4 horses. One they ate, 2 for riding, one they could change so that they could keep traveling and even slept in the saddle. And finally, a battle horse. They were great fighters, experts with the crossbow. And the world had not seen the like of an army so mobile, so effective, so fast, and indeed, so ruthless. They conquered all before them, and they built this huge empire quickly of vassal states that owed their allegiance to the great Khan. And some Christians, of course, at the beginning, before the Mongols became Muslims, saw these Mongols as God's judgment on the Muslim world. God was raising up a warrior, they thought, who was going to rid the world of Islam. In Philip Jenkins's book, this period is covered in an excellent chapter called The Great Tribulation. And in it, he quotes a very chilling apocalyptic tract from a Christian called Solomon of Basra in the 1220s. This is what Solomon writes. All of a sudden, there shall be raised up against them pains like those of a woman in childbirth. It means Muslims, of course. And the king of the Greeks shall go forth against them in great wrath, and he shall rouse himself like a man who has shaken off his wine. He shall go forth against the sea of the Cushites, and shall cast the sword and destruction into the wilderness of Yathrib, Medina, and into the dwelling place of their fathers. All the wrath and anger of the king of the Greeks shall have full course upon those who have denied Christ. It's rather worrying, I suppose, to see the glee with which violence on Muslim overlords is wished by some Christians. But it was true that the initial Mongol successor states appeared to have little love for Islam at the beginning, with the exception probably of Egypt, which did have a terrible persecution of Christians in the 1100s. One of the great Khans, in fact, Genghis Khan, 1162 to 1227, was actually quite tolerant of Christianity, and there's even some evidence he might have been a Christian himself. But this all changes in 1295, when a new Khan takes over, and his name is Mahmud Ghazan. He converts to Islam, and he begins a massive persecution of Christians. He has a brother who follows him, Ojaitu, 1304 to 1316, and he's even worse, and he was baptized a Christian. And so was unleashed probably the most widespread and terrible violence against the church ever in its history. It's the most genocidal century humankind has ever experienced. And it was motivated significantly by the desire to slaughter Christians and other non-Muslims. You can read some of the chilling edicts that came from these Muslim Khans. Here's one. The churches shall be uprooted, the altars overturned, and the celebrations of the Eucharist shall cease. And the hymns of praise and the sounds of calls to prayer shall be abolished, and the heads of the Christians shall be killed. There's nothing subtle about all this, but what is remarkable is the systematic ambition. Not only were hundreds of thousands of Christians killed, but there was the deliberate annihilation of Christian leaders and priests and scriptures and churches and monasteries. It's a very thorough genocidal project. And then after that, there comes a man called Timur Lane, 1336 to 1405. And he's from what's called Uzbekistan today, and he is probably one of the most violent figures in the whole of history. Jenkins has a chilling paragraph about him. He writes, "It was a Muslim ruler who administered the coup de grace to the Christian Middle East. In the 1360s, the warlord Timur began a career that would make him Khan over most of Asia, and his homicidal policies toward captured cities followed closely those of his Mongol predecessors. His distinctive custom, or his trademark, was to exterminate the population of any city that resisted him, and to erect a giant pyramid from the skulls of his victims, men, women, and children. And considering the much smaller population of the world at that time, Timur's depredations probably inflicted greater slaughter in relative terms than would either Hitler or Stalin in their day." So writes Jenkins. So Christianity begins to disappear in huge swathes of the Middle East and Asia. It disappears from Persia, Iraq, many parts of Central Asia. In countries such as Georgia, it's reduced to a struggling minority. And we talked about this, remember, when we were doing the 6 Ds and the 5 marks, how violence, which we call destroy, is one of the 6 tactics. And of course, it's still the case, but probably in most parts of the world today, persecutors rarely have a kind of annihilation strategy towards Christians. Genocide looks bad. It draws the world's opprobrium. The leader who starts a genocide doesn't get invited to Davos, doesn't get any foreign trade. But state violence, mob violence, tribal violence, it's still very prominent around the world today. If you go to India, you will find that Hindu extremists have built what we call a frenzy-building mechanism, creating mobs to beat up a pastor or burn a church. The most violent area in the world today for Christians is actually sub-Saharan Africa. You're most likely to lose your life for your faith in a place like northern Nigeria. Mobs, as we saw, are almost never spontaneous. They're usually organized because rioters have to be roused and fed and transported to the scene, whipped up, handed torches or bricks or guns. And sometimes there are countries where there are very few Christians because violence has scoured them from the land. Somalia is a case in point. Very few Christians there. And if you convert to Christ in Somalia, you had better get out fast, or your tribe, or an extremist group like Al-Shabaab, or your family will kill you. So there's no doubt about the permanent change. And remember, we referenced Samuel Moffat about persecution that hacks the trunk down as opposed to the pruning of the branches. This was a clearing of the forest like never before or since. Philip Jenkins writes, he says, "These persecutions had a greater effect on the churches of the Middle East than any other event since the conversion of the Roman Empire." And so for the next 500 years, Christianity becomes a minority in Asia, and it still is. And for that period of time, Christianity became a predominantly Western religion. Now, this has perhaps changed a bit. We could say the center of world Christianity might be a city like Lagos, but that's very new. And so we have to remember the frightening power violence has when it's applied on a macro scale, withering faith in all its forms.